Hey guys, so today I wanted to hop on and make a video all about my top tips for buying designer vintage. I have, over the past couple of years, become absolutely obsessed and in love with buying vintage, more specifically designer vintage and designer vintage accessories, and more specifically Chanel. I love Chanel as a brand, and I feel like they're one of the brands that are, the very few brands that actually, vintage wise, a lot of their items become more valuable with age, so it's kind of like a good investment as well. And it's also, there's a lot of it available because people do look after Chanel products. Also true for other brands to a certain extent, Dior, Louis Vuitton, things like that, the more kind of prestigious, older, generally French fashion houses. But just doing a little bit of a disclaimer, I'm not an expert, I'm just very, very into it. And this is my experience and my tips from being an absolute vintage novice a couple of years ago to learning lots about it, being really into it, doing lots of research online, buying lots of things and making a few mistakes along the way. I thought I would give you a few of my tips. I've done a video a little bit like this before when I did my vintage Chanel collection, but I feel like that's probably 2 years old now, so a little bit out of date, and also not specifically focused on tips. Also, one thing to note, there's a big difference between buying pre-owned, so second-hand. Anything that is over 20 years old counts as vintage, and I believe anything that's over 50 years old counts as antique. So I'm more specifically talking about vintage items here rather than pre-owned. They do tend to be a little bit different, in my opinion, mostly because it's a lot harder to fake vintage than it is to fake pre-owned and newer designs, for obvious reasons. Like, faking kind of 30 years worth of wear and the quality of certain things that were made you know, over 20 years ago is a lot harder than faking something that is new. But also for the reason of pricing is very different and wear is very different, condition, things like that. And there's just different things to look out for. So that's what I'm talking about today. So first of all, I want to talk about where to buy from. And I feel like if you are looking for a bargain, you can find probably the best bargains in shops. However, it is much harder to find vintage items in vintage stores, purely because they are fairly few and far between, and if you're not based in a big city, can be quite difficult in terms of going in and finding, like, oh my god, amazing vintage designer pieces in Oxfam or whatever charity shop. It's probably not going to happen. You might get very, very lucky, but because vintage is so popular now, and also vintage designer items are so valuable in a lot of cases, you know, a lot of the shops know what to look for, so they're not going to put out a vintage Chanel 2.55 for like 50 quid and not understand what it is. So like, a lot of the people that work in charity shops are trained in designer goods and will know to recognize them, and they usually now will get sent, I know in the case of Oxfam, because I've worked with them a few times, that it will get sent to kind of the online shop and sold off for its kind of proper value, to make money for the charity, which of course it should. Anyway, so that's probably the best place to find the bargains. However, in my opinion, the best place to shop for vintage is online, because you have access to so much. You have access to shops all over the world. A lot of vintage shops and vintage sellers do list online. Some of them are purely online, and if you think about you know, you've got access to so much. You can compare, you can barter, you can kind of look out for the most like rare things. If you're after one thing, you can set up alerts using different websites and services for like exactly what you're looking for. So online is the best place to shop. In terms of which websites, it really depends what you're looking for. If you're looking for something very unusual and specific, or rare, or in absolutely mint condition, websites like Farfetch are incredible, because they have a very select, curated selection of vintage pieces from reputable vintage sellers that they will list. However, if you're looking for a bargain, because Farfetch tends to be quite expensive in that respect, because they do sell a lot of the rarer mint products, if you're looking for more of a bargain, I would 100% recommend shopping on Vestiaire. And I love that process for me, because they allow you to barter. And this is another one of my tips: if you can, barter, because the value of vintage items is very much dependent on, you know, what people are willing to pay, what other similar items have been bought for that exact money recently, and it's all a little bit pie in the sky because RRP obviously changes all the time for Chanel and for other designer brands, and it's going up and up and up and up, and a lot of the vintage prices are based on the kind of price increases that we've seen. So some of these bags might have been bought for £100, like, or £200 25, 30 years ago, and they're now selling for thousands for the equivalent bag. But obviously that is increasing the price of the vintage item hugely. So it changes, it develops, but it's definitely worth making an offer. And Vestiaire allows you to kind of make an offer and have that bartering element. eBay is also great. I want to talk about eBay a little bit because eBay gets a bad rep in terms of designer stuff for there's a lot of fakes on there. There are a lot of fakes on eBay. As hard as eBay try to stop that, it's always going to happen because it's so huge and it's not regulated and they don't have authenticity checks. That's the thing with Vestiaire as well. Like, you can be confident buying from there because they do have that authenticity check. It gets sent to Vestiaire, they authenticate it, and then they send it on to you. But eBay obviously doesn't have that. However, when it comes to vintage, like I said in the beginning, it's a lot harder to fake vintage items. So once you kind of get to know Chanel or Louis Vuitton or Dior, whatever vintage item you're after, once you kind of get to know that brand, get to know what to look for, the quality, the level of wear, also various checks in terms of serial numbers and things like that, which I will talk about in a minute, you can kind of tell what's fake and what's not. However, I would say this, a lot of the real stuff on eBay tends to be really expensive or really cheap, and it's a little bit of a trickier, like harder site to navigate for shopping vintage. But if you are lucky, you can find some really good things on there. The same goes for Depop. I found a vintage Chanel vanity case on Depop for about £300 once. I think it was actually, was it 200 and something? Either way, it was an absolute find, and they sell for thousands elsewhere. It wasn't in the best condition, but it was such a good bargain find, and it's something that I wouldn't have been willing to buy for a huge amount of money, so I was really, really happy with that. But it is a one-off. There's a lot of junk on Depop, a lot of junk, but it is worth keeping an eye on. So my favourite places, if I'm looking for something really special and mint, Farfetch. If I'm looking for something less so, tends to be Vestiaire. Luxury Promise is also another London-based seller, and they tend to sell for very, very good prices, but a lot of their stuff is more pre-owned as opposed to vintage. They do have vintage. Their quality level tends to be a little bit lower in my experience, but their prices are really good. So if you're looking for something that's a little bit more affordable, definitely barter on Vestiaire or Luxury Promise. There's loads of other different sellers as well, and a lot of them do list on Vestiaire, so or Farfetch, depending on the kind of quality, if you get what I mean. So yeah, they're my favorite places to look. In terms of how, like, knowing if something is real, like I said before, a lot of these sellers offer like an authentication service. They'll send it with a certificate. If they don't, and when you're looking, it's definitely worth getting familiar with the coding system. For Chanel, there's a really good website that tells you, even if you're trying to find out the year, because that's what I find frustrating as well with a lot of vintage items. They get listed, they show the security code, but they don't actually say, like, this is from 1993 or this is from 1981. They just put the code, so you have to then go and look on the code. But there is a very, very good blog post on a website which tells you what all the codes mean, what year they're from, kind of what the exact sticker should look like. Because this is the other thing, is that Chanel change the authenticity sticker that is inside all of their bags and small leather goods pretty much every time they release a new number. They change the like design and the hologram and all of that. So it's quite, they make it difficult for people to fake that. So yeah, that's definitely worth going to look for. Also, pay very, very close attention when you're buying jewelry as well, because they have a similar, there's also another blog post actually that's really good about jewelry that I'll link below as well, but they have a similar kind of process for dating and all, and kind of hallmarking all of their jewelry. Chanel costume jewelry is crazy expensive, especially the vintage stuff, crazy expensive for what it is, because essentially it's not real, it's not fine jewelry. However, and this is why I love the vintage pieces so much, during the 80s and the 90s, I feel like they had such an incredible quality and design kind of basis, which I think once it went like scaled up, especially for Chanel, once everything scaled up in the 2000s and beyond, the quality went down a lot. So that's why I tend to prefer vintage Chanel jewelry as opposed to the newer like pre-owned stuff, because the quality was just so much better. It was so much heavier and richer, and it just, the design was amazing. But they do have a very specific set of dating stamps and hallmarking that changed a lot as well. So it changed after a few years. When Karl Lagerfeld came in the 80s, he changed it, then it changed again. So it's definitely worth looking out for that, because it, at one point they actually wrote the date on it. On other points that changed to collections and things like that. So definitely do your research and double check on those two websites that I'll link below, because they're a really good kind of resource to look back to kind of authenticate everything that you're looking at online. The other thing that I would say is, when you're looking, obviously most vintage items are going to have been worn. Sometimes you'll get a crazy find and it will be like brand new in the box from like 1983 and it'll never have been worn. However, most things have been worn. But the one thing I would say is, when you're looking at everything, blow up the pictures as big as you can. Don't look at it on your phone, look at it on your computer, blow it up, put the brightness on, and look for every single like little niggle of damage, because sometimes they'll list damage on the websites, other times they won't. This is another thing as well, is like read the fine print in terms of damage, odor, kind of what each website classes as you know, excellent condition, very good condition changes slightly. And some websites say, you know, so Vestiaire is very good at this. It will give you the exact parameters of what counts as excellent condition, what counts as good condition, etc. And if something doesn't meet those requirements and it gets through authenticity checks, then you are actually in a position where you can send it back. And this happened to me with Vestiaire, with a specific bag that had been painted. And this is another thing that I want to talk about with vintage Chanel, especially with beige. It's very common for it to be painted and restored. Not always a bad thing, but if it's done badly, it can look really bad. And this is exactly what happened on this one beige lambskin Chanel Square Mini that I bought almost 2 years ago now. It had been painted and it hadn't been painted that well. However, I had specifically asked, has this bag been restored? And the seller had said no, and they had listed it as very good condition, which is like they'd essentially lied, or even that, or they didn't realise and they didn't have enough experience with it to know. But obviously, because that was kind of missold, I could send it back to Vestiaire. But in a lot of cases, if you just haven't read the small print, or if you just haven't noticed a certain element of the bag, like it being restored versus actually being damaged, then you might end up with a bag that you don't want and you can't return it. That's the other thing as well. Read the small print and learn who has a good returns policy in terms of vintage, especially when you're buying clothes, because sometimes they don't fit. Farfetch is brilliant for this. Again, you're paying that premium because you get the good quality vintage pieces, but you also have an incredible return service. And this isn't sponsored by Farfetch or Vestiaire, just to point that out. I do work with Farfetch, but this is completely separate. So it's definitely worth checking the fine print in terms of returns as well, because a lot of the sites won't let you return. Vestiaire has a service where they will let you repost your item for less commission if you don't like it within, I think it's within like a month or 3 months. I've never actually done that because Vestiaire do charge a huge chunk of commission if you are just a regular person selling. They charge less if you're a professional seller and you do it a lot, but definitely read the fine print. Also, a note on sizing with vintage items. Women back in the day generally, apparently, were smaller and the sizes were smaller. I don't know whether we've just moved into more vanity sizing, but when it comes to vintage, the sizes do tend to run a little bit smaller, especially with designer, which runs a little bit smaller anyway in my experience than high street. But don't be afraid to ask questions. Ask questions about odor, condition, sizing, all of that. Ask all the questions you want to ask and make sure you ask them before you buy it, because you might not be able to send it back. But in my experience, things do tend to run small, so just check, and it's worth always just asking the seller because usually they're really friendly. Another reason to read the fine print is, especially in auction houses, I've bought from Bonhams before and been really surprised by how high their commission rate was. I just assumed it would be like antique auction, like my local antique auction commission rate, and it wasn't, and I ended up spending a lot more on a bag than I had wanted to, and that would have been one of my regrets. The other thing, read the fine print, is the size. If something just says it's a, you know, large Chanel bag or large whatever bag you're buying, and you don't actually double check that the large is what you think the large is, you can sometimes get caught out. I once got caught out on this as well by buying what I thought was a small Chanel boy bag, and it was actually a mini, which was like this big. You couldn't even put a phone in it, and I ended up reselling that. But yeah, definitely always read the fine print, especially around size as well. And that's pretty much it for my kind of online vintage buying tips. The other thing I would really say and kind of reiterate is to barter on price, because most of the time people will have a little bit of movement, and they'll expect you to do that. When you're buying antiques or vintage anything, people always expect you to try and haggle. Sometimes people just say no, that's fine, but 9 times out of 10 they're not going to be offended that you asked, because that's how it goes in secondhand, in pre-loved, in vintage. If you do have the opportunity or the tool on the website to make an offer, you might as well try. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you would like to see any more kind of secondhand, vintage, pre-loved kind of content, if you have any suggestions or requests, then please let me know in the comments, and I hope you all have a fantastic day, and I'll see you very soon. Bye guys.